Welcome, everybody. I just want to thank the Royal Society of Musicians for facilitating this session. It's very, very helpful that they've been so supportive of musicians' health. Without going through every single professional body that have supported this event, we have managed to contact most of the professional bodies representing musicians and teachers in this country. And I'm delighted they've all actually been very positive about recommending this event to their members. What's interesting in my current professional capacity is that I quite often get asked to do staff training sessions, and sometimes even get asked to review music departments, for instance, of the specialist music schools. And I've also done some consultancy and review for Arts Council England. So since I retired as being joint principal of Trinity Laban, now over a decade ago, I've had a lot of experience of actually interacting with people at the coalface, doing music teaching, not just at conservatoire level, but at every single level. I've actually encountered some really inspirational teaching, really exciting ways of communicating with young people. As you would expect, I've experienced some what one would describe as traditional teaching, which just follows the grade system or the assessment system at Conservatoire, etc. And so why are we doing this? Because certainly the professional bodies that everyone belongs to actually run their own events. So it's not that you can't get some sort of connection or advice or interaction on the subject of teaching instruments within other August bodies. But what's been a factor in the work that I've done with members of staff of various organisations is that initially they've been reluctant to attend because they're busy professionals and every hour they spend away from their craft as they're not earning their living. But once we've got going, there's been tremendous enthusiasm and a lot of input, and people have been excited to actually share with colleagues their own ideas. And these have not been instrument specific. I've had all instruments at these sessions, but being able to communicate well is generic to putting across any teachings. I'm sure we would all agree. I'm not going to spend hours talking at you because there's nothing worse than being taught at, but just to explain the structure of this morning's event, I'm very, very excited to have 4 volunteer presenters. I have Nias Peris, who is a pianist. I have Julia Mornweg, who is a cellist. I have Peter Knapp, who is a singer. And I have another pianist, but from a completely different angle, Chiara Naudi. I would have liked a wind player, but nobody signed up to do that. But I'm happy with the 4 I've got, and I'm very grateful that they're giving up their time without a fee because they're all busy professionals who have to earn their living. So each one of the presenters will make a presentation about their experience of what I'm calling transformational teaching, which I'll explain in slightly more detail in a moment. That presentation will last 10, 15 minutes, not more. And afterwards, there will be another period of time where you can actually ask them directly questions about their presentation. If there are more questions than can be answered in the time available, we will have to actually bring those forward to the end of the session. After 2 presentations, we're going to have a quick break. People may want to use the bathroom or make a cup of tea or even refresh their gin and tonic. Unfortunately, despite the hospitality of the Royal Society of Musicians, they haven't provided me with the gin and tonic, but maybe afterwards. So then we'll do 2 more, and hopefully there will be a time at the end of the 4 presentations when people have thought, oh, if only I'd asked this, or only I'd asked that. they can come into a general wash up at the end. Similarly, if people have questions they want to put in the chat, again, if there is time during each person's presentation, we will alert them to these questions. But again, if there isn't time within the allocated space, we will try and answer them at the end. And if we end up with more input than we are able to deal with in the 2-hour or so session that we've allocated to this, then we will try and answer any unanswered questions through email or electronic means after the end of this session. So that's basically the structure. Just to talk very briefly about what I consider is transformational teaching. Transformational teaching is where a way of communicating something has absolutely enlightened someone's understanding. Now, I give very, very quick illustrations of that from my own experience. At Trinity Laban now, I'm Emeritus Professor of Education, and in addition to continuing to teach the cello, I lecture in the physiology and psychology of performance training, practice techniques, and pedagogy. So I was taking a pedagogy lecture to all the string players 2 weeks ago. And I asked the students to come up and show me how to hold a violin bow. And I got what I expected, really, was that I was told that this finger goes here, this finger goes here, and long explanations, which if I was a 9-year-old child, I might not really have followed. And then somebody came up with something which was incredibly amusing, but I shall remember for the rest of my career. They were talking about the need to have a rounded shape of the hand rather than the flat shape. So they said, well, imagine you're holding a hamster. Because if you were to squeeze the hamster too hard, that would be very painful for the hamster. We all laughed, of course, but nevertheless, it stuck in my mind. I'm sure it was stuck in the mind. So that was an example of somebody using an illustrative way to describe something as complicated as a bow hold. Very briefly, my own take on this is that the human hand assumes natural shapes depending what objects we're holding. If I hold my phone, my subconscious brain tells me I'm holding a flat object, so I need to have my fingers flat and my thumb flat in order to hold it. If I'm holding a ball, then I would bring my hand together like this, because if I was to try and hold it like the phone, it would be most uncomfortable. So in my experience of teaching bow holds to children, I've tried to get them to feel that round hand shape by, I've got a handkerchief here, rolling that handkerchief up into a ball in their hand. So they're holding it like holding a ball, and then putting the bow in as well. And so it feels comfortable because the palm of their hand is filled. And you can continue with that until they've become so used to it. You then take the handkerchief away and you've got a bow hold. That's just one example. Not now dwelling on my own experience, but looking at other experiences of transformational teaching. I was interviewing for a position of trumpet teacher at Trinity Laban, and various distinguished people apply for the position. But part of the appointments process was they had to teach in front of the appointments panel. And one particular teacher recognized that this trumpet student was struggling to play a passage in tune. And whereas lots of other applicants had gone into the detail of the embouchure and the mantelpiece, lots of technical detail, he said, take the mouthpiece out of the trumpet and put the trumpet down. And now pitch it on the mouthpiece, which is much more difficult to do without the benefit of the valves, etc. It was terrible to start off with. It's okay, just hear the note you want to play and just get it on the mouthpiece as best you can. So after a few minutes of this, he said, well, put it back in the trumpet, you'll find it easy now. And she played it perfectly in tune. For me, that was a transformational experience with that student's understanding. Another example to do with a singer, I was then interviewing for a vocal coach. And again, the candidate heard the singer and her accompanist perform, and he actually said to the singer, "What's the piece about?" It was in French. I can't remember the title of the composer. And she said, "It's about moonlight." And so he asked the singer to read out the words. And then he said to the pianist, "Did you know all of that?" So the pianist shook her head. He said, "Well, just imagine moonlight and play it again." Totally transformed. Now, you would have thought it was a perfectly logical thing to do for the singer to explain, the singing student, to explain to her pianist what the song was about. But because she was singing in French and the pianist was from the Far East, it was taken for granted rather than something simple like explaining what the song's about, transform their understanding. One last example, again, this is from my own career. When you're playing the violin, gravity brings your arm out like this, which is great. When you're playing the cello, you get here and you're blocked. And so many people push the rest of their arm out from this muscle here, and it actually means that they get pain and the arm gets locked. So I explain, if they think of that they're drawing a sword out of a scabbard, so they have basically their left hand is forming the scabbard and draw it out. Of course, the arm opens naturally, and the bow actually won't move if you're not doing that. You have to do this movement in order to get the bow through the scabbard. And then it becomes easier to understand it happening here. So it's finding ways of explaining things which transform people's understanding. And as I said a few minutes ago, I've witnessed many, many examples of this. And the most wonderful oboe lesson I witnessed a few months ago, which was, I was inspired, almost made me want to take up the oboe, just by having only been a cellist for the whole of my career. So this is what this session is about. We're trying to share these examples from our own experience so everybody can be inspired by your inspiration. And the input from the participants is equally as important as it is that you're going to hear from the presenters. And then we hope to create a digital library if we do further sessions like this for anybody, but whatever professional body they belong to or no professional body, to be able to access this and to be able to witness others' teachers' experience. Because teaching instruments can be quite a lonely occupation. We don't always manage to engage with our colleagues. So enough from me. So I'm going to hand over to Nias now, who's going to talk about her own experience of transformational teaching. Yes.
Thanks, Derek. As Derek said, I'm a classically trained pianist, and I also teach. And my teaching practice now happens a lot at prep schools in Southeast London. So I decided to base my presentation on how to give a very good start to the little ones. And I interrogate myself a lot about how was my own start in specifically piano, but in music in general, and how to make that better for my students, basically. I'd like to share an idea, which is how to. For me, I've come to the realization that it's good to go from big ideas to small ideas, like from big movements to slowly shaping them into a more precise or refined movement when it comes to musical education. And I'd like to start with a philosophical concept that I picked from Victor Wooten, a jazz bass player, virtuoso, top-notch player, who grew up in a family of musicians. He grew up with his 3 brothers, if I'm right. They were already touring internationally when he was 2-3 years old, and they would rehearse at home. And the way they initiated him was to put a little stool with a little toy guitar in the middle of the rehearsal space. So as they would play all the groups, the child would be jumping up and down and feeling that energy and vibrating with them. And from there, they shaped that into, now play this harmony, try this other thing, try this groove. And he's a top musician. He became a top musician by this type of like being in the spot and imitating and then letting things into his system. Right. So he's got a very interesting TED talk about music as language and about how we learn our mother tongue by just trying. No one expects us to be talking perfectly to interact with us. They let us do our little contributions and reply to that, adding a bit more so we can take a bit more in and in that way develop. So he's got that analogy with how he learned music in relation to, how he learned in the English language. With this idea also from big to small, there's this pianist, American pianist, Abby Whiteside. I'm very happy to share all the references, by the way, at the end of the talk. Abby Whiteside, she was a top-notch pianist as well, and an excellent professor and teacher who would teach. She was very democratic. She would teach anyone that would want to learn. She wasn't selective at all in terms of talented, non-talented. She was not selective, and she would with children, she would have that idea, like, I'm sure you've seen like a first piano lesson. Sometimes the child walks in and starts like faking it, like, I'm a pianist, and with a lot of energy. And it's that energy that we can channel. We don't have to stop that completely and start manufacturing all the moves. Like, the energy is there. How do we take that energy and channel it and shape it into refined musicianship? My start was not like that at all. It was based on detail, on like that pulse that is like two-dimensional, where you kind of move based on the rhythm values, on the length of the notes, not on a pulse that has space in between the beats. And in between the beats, you move effortlessly. Brackets, that's Derek Aviss's input. And yes. So basically, I learned with that two-dimensional pulse where one has to be in time, hit the right note, hit the right rhythm, and also pay attention to detail in terms of dynamic and articulation, which basically produced a lot of tension, because it's a lot of cognitive attention that you have to pay to all these what feels like separate items. And I was always musical and I was always keen, but that didn't feel easy or effortless. It was quite a lot of effort and tension. So reflecting on the pulse and how what I've learned from Derek and other teachers as well. Now in hindsight, I see that some other teachers gave me hints, but with Derek, I really synced into that and took pulse as a frame, as so time is the creative space of music, as the canvas is the creative space of a painting. For a painter, they have that and they organize their elements. But for us, it's time. So this ongoing pulse with space in between is how we organize our moves according to that, how we can create a continuous sort of movement that fits itself and that makes music making effortlessly. And the same way, instead of paying attention to play loud, play soft, you can like infuse more energy into that system once you've coordinated all the hand movements and arm and body movements according, like in relationship to that pulse. If you infuse more energy, will sound louder, less energy. It's all within the same activity. It all converges in one point or one space. It's more mindful, I would say. And another topic that I wanted to bring up, like children composing. So in primary school, when children draw, we receive that really well. Oh, how beautiful. And it can be like really 3 lines of different colors and then a circle somewhere else. And we celebrate that. In music, we don't accept, I find, I don't know, I might be wrong, but I find that we are more critical and judgmental of the creations by children. And like, so clashy. So I think it's interesting as a practitioner to allow them to give that a space from time to time in the lesson. And again, this idea of from big to small, like from that sort of sketch that they are presenting you, from their own motivation, which can be simply physical enjoyment or more related to sound or more related to an atmosphere or an idea that they have. So respect that, and from there, try and infuse something new. Try and add, listen to this, like bring their attention to different details. In that way, we can shape this creativity into something that comes from within, feels good to them. They feel like what they present has a value, and then they can work on that. Okay, well, so that's like the philosophical part of it, my approach. Then I'd like to talk more about the sense of pulse and how I think it's important that for me, when I have like 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds that are really young and really playful and has lots of energy, not and they don't have that refined coordination straight away. So I always use a part of the lesson away from the piano, 5 minutes away from the piano, to build up on building blocks of rhythm and other things. Let me explain more precise examples now. So, for example, walking and counting and clapping in all their combinations. And all these exercises can be developed into, for example, the primary school years. My students, I give them development of these exercises. We keep working on more complicated versions. But for example, walking around a room, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, they coordinate, they feel the pulse, and then clapping on 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, then clapping on 2, 1, 2, 3. And you'll see that at 5 or 6 years old, that's not that straightforward. But it takes like just a teeny tiny bit of attention to give them like that stability, that grounding in doing that it's worth taking care of that. Then you can keep complicating that. Instead of clapping only one beat, you can do combinations of 2 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. And at the beginning they won't get it right, but it takes like really short time for them to take things, such basic things on. Then another, from my jazz studies that I took as an optional subjects in my undergrad, I could see that they have like dedicated subjects, like dedicated times to study rhythm in depth. And so I continued this walk clap business in the lesson into being able to clap offbeat, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, until my students know exactly where these beats are. And so when we encounter that in a piece of music, in a written piece of music, they have the feeling, they know how it feels, and it's easy to create a link for them to, oh, I know what that is. So we don't have to struggle with the notes, with the everything together. And that part has been dealt with in a fun and engaging way. What else? Then I have this part of the lesson that I think they find quite engaging, because I always like to have a selection of percussion instruments. I don't know if you'll be able to see them, with different qualities. So we've got this bell, for example. Beautiful sound, sustained, it's very long. Claves. With claves, if you hold them like that, they don't resonate. But if you create a little cavity in your hand, And then that can explain that explains an important principle of sound and resonance. This one, you've got two tones here. If you stick it, the sound will stop. And then a castanet. So dealing with these instruments, give them a good scope of how the sound works and how to make it sound properly, If they start bring their attention to, because these vibrate and the vibrations come to your ear through the air. So then it's easy to make connections with how the piano works, how the string is hit by the hammer, but not pushing too much. It's easy to say, look, if you're pushing too much, that's as if you're pushing, keep pushing on the bell, that stops the sound or creates a harsh sound. So there's a lot of things that we can take from working apart from the instrument to then create the links. With the percussion instruments, I introduce new rhythms. For example, let me get one. For example, dotted, crotchet, and quaver. That would be a bit more advanced, say, I don't know, 7 years old. So I would start picking one instrument. They would pick another one. Then I would start doing, and they would copy me. Then I link some of them. Then they would copy me. And then I would start with the dotted crotchet at the beginning. Copy me. And then I would show them how we write that. And I would set them to there, to there, to there. So now then we can play that with the instruments, looking at the written example. And I find having one of these very useful, because depending on what you need, you can quickly work something out and do all these exercises with the relevant. And also, let me see, I wanted to say one more thing here. Also, once we've introduced this sort of rhythms, in the future, when we finally encounter this rhythm, they will have that experience already. So creating the link, again, is really easy. And it's really fun to still use these, for a minute in the lesson, to take up a new work and read, let's play the rhythm of the first 8 bars with this. And it's a nice change of medium, and I think it keeps it fresh and engaging. Now from there, once we have this way of playing integrated, where where the student feels they play from beat to beat and feel light in between beats and able to relax, play in a relaxed and free way, it's easy to bring the attention to read the dynamics. What does the composer want here? What do they suggest? It starts piano. What does this mean? Quiet. Perfect. Let's start quiet, but do it gently. It's easy from there to gently introduce direct things, so they feel like a small effort into, a small, a thought into that, and combined with how they feel about the music, what it suggests to them, makes a real change without having to be too stiff about it. Ooh, sorry. And basically, I would just encourage everyone to try and keep lessons engaging and fun, not being too pressured by exams, and try to always save a bit of time to do some foundational work that is engaging, fun, and helps the student to relax and feel, and that's my alarm, and feel the pulse and be happy. That would be it. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nias. Are there any questions directly to Nias, or if you think about things you wish you'd ask her, we will have an opportunity for you to actually question every presenter at the end of the session.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, either put them in the chat or do just put your hand up or just speak. Either is fine.
No. Okay, well, I'm sure things will occur to you and in the course of the morning. So from piano, what Niels has talked about is a way of keeping children's attention and trying to get them to learn music as a language as opposed to something more formal than that. So we're now going over to my discipline, which is string playing. So I'd like Julia to come in now and talk to us about what she has, in her experience, found a way of explaining something which can be transformational.
Julia. Thank you very much, Derek. A very good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me as part of this wonderful workshop. I'm going to be talking today about a scenario which is actually not a million miles away from what you described earlier about the trumpet. And it's a scenario which every string player, string teacher knows very well from their own experience and also from teaching, and that is students who present with intonation issues. So that, of course, intonation for any string player, the absolute bane of our lives. So the presentation that I'm going to give today, I have sort of given a little working title to, and that is Hearing is Automatic, Listening is Learned. And what I want to share with you today is sort of my strategies for making quite rapid intonation improvements in string players. And those really work at pretty much any level. Of course, you will be looking at something slightly different when you're working with a beginner versus when you're preparing someone for a principal cello audition, but the principle still remains the same. So I first of all want to start a little bit with the presentation, the way the student presents. And whenever somebody comes to play to me for the first time, either as a consultation lesson or maybe sometimes in a masterclass situation, after they've finished, I usually start with a question. And that question is, if I had a magic wand and you could ask me to fix one thing for you right here and right now, what would it be? And about 90% of the time, the answer somewhere involves, I'd love to be able to play more in tune. So, what has marked the performance usually that has preceded that question? And usually what happens, especially, when a student plays to you for the first time and there is obviously some apprehension there, there's some nervousness there. So that's, obviously, like for all of us, a situation when everything tends to sort of come out in the wash. And very often the playing is marked by not just, we all miss a shift here or there, but it's a latent general level of, let's call it approximation, just a little bit of lack of intonation accuracies. And the way I can always tell that the student is aware of it, not necessarily aware of exactly what is wrong and how to fix it, but aware that something isn't quite right, is while they're playing, usually I always say I get a slightly sheepish look. And it's like, yeah, I know it isn't quite right, but you can also see that clearly these students are very hardworking, they practice, but you can see that they haven't got the tool to really address the problem. And of course, once the student perceives that lack of control over their intonation, what then kicks in is what very technically would be called the sort of maladaptive compensation loop, which in plain English we can just call a very vicious spiral. And that is, of course, one of ever-increasing left-hand tension, because we don't feel secure, so we just try to hold on to it for dear life in a hope to to add more security, which of course leads to the complete opposite. And likewise, on the other side, it leads to ever diminishing bow support, going ever higher onto the fingerboard. Because again, the brain has got this panic reaction, this illusion that, okay, if I give a little bit less power in the bow, the mistake will be less obvious. Again, the polar opposite is true. The less bow support you give, the more the left hand will lose security. So, in that situation, what do we as teachers do? Very much like what Derek described earlier on the trumpet, there's a very common tendency, and that's very, very tempting, to just start going into all the individual technical processes which aren't quite working. The shifting and the bow, and you can easily spend a whole masterclass session or a whole lesson having gone through lots of these things, and maybe have even given a ton of really useful information, but tomorrow the student isn't going to magically play any more in tune than they did today. So instead, I take the mechanical out of the equation altogether, first of all. And because the first thing that I as a teacher need to know is what is their baseline sense of pitch and hearing when they are not faced with all the mechanical challenges. What do they actually, how well can they sing in tune? So that's the first thing. I might ask them to sing a passage. And then I do something completely different. And I have them play a little passage with an object. So here I've got a potato. And I'm going to give them something like that. Potato is quite a good shape and quite a good texture for it. And I simply will have them play, stopping the string, not with the fingers. But with that object, in this case a potato. Now, nearly in every case, the singing, as well as what I call the potato playing, produce considerably more accurate intonation than the normal playing did, with four fingers plus the thumb at the disposal. So, first question, how is it possible that with something so clumsy as having to move a potato around the fingerboard, we still end up playing cleaner than with our fingers? And this discovery is usually a huge surprise to the student, but it's also often a bit of a breakthrough moment. So we have to look a little bit at actually the neuroscience of what happens in the process. Because hearing is something that is automatic, but hearing is something that is very much developmentally designed really to ensure and help with our survival. It's there to signal danger, to really, it's hearing automatically, it perceives noise. It's just something we can't help it. We hear things even if we don't want to hear them. But listening is something different altogether. It requires an active choice and it requires prioritization. That's something we have to make a conscious effort to listen above all the other activities. It's also an activity that is hugely cognitively expensive. So it really takes a huge amount of concentration. Yeah, so it's a little bit like on our computer. That's the one application that's taking up an enormous amount of working memory, and that really gets the computer heating up. Obviously, in the context of competing demands for focus, I mean, playing a string instrument, it's really, like sort of juggling balls in one hand and, rubbing your tummy in the other. Obviously, the attention gets allocated in the first place to the mechanics, to what you would call the motor survival, you know, just trying to be on the right string, have the fingers in the right place, and listening in the first case automatically gets relegated. Now, that's the case even for a highly accomplished, highly experienced player who has to sight read something complex, for instance. That is exactly what happens. We first of all just try to hang on for dear life and get around it. And afterwards, with each further go, we then have more cognitive capacity to start actually listening to what we're doing and start to clean things up. So while the brain is completely overloaded, what I call the tolerance threshold for intonation inaccuracy remains very, very high. And so that's why we really have to find strategies and I use these from a very, very, very early stage in someone's training, to teach and constantly train what I would call active listening. So, what are the strategies that I use in which order? So the initial goal with someone in that situation is I want to reduce the competing cognitive demands, bring that right down to a level where really we can just focus on the listening. And I need to introduce exercises which place the responsibility for the correct placement of the note, correct placement of the finger, solely on the ear. So I literally remove all other options. You have to use the ear. There's nothing else left. So, and that means initially we completely do away with the concept of fingerings. So I'm back to the potato. That's where I start. Because the one thing by using the potato that I take out of the question is proprioception. So you can't go anymore by, oh yeah, I think it's somewhere here, and you're trying to sort of almost, visually see where you're going. So when we have that in our hand, we've only got one control mechanism. And to a very, very small degree, you can correct with that. And you really make someone listen with that. And obviously with a less experienced student, let's say someone who is in the very early stages of learning, we'll first of all start by learning to match, let's say, notes to open strings precisely. Yeah, so I'll have them play that as a reference. And then with that, we try to find the exact octave above or 2 octaves above or whatever it is. And I try to get them to really listen very, very carefully to the resonance of the instrument, to the overtones, to the point where, you really, I always say, you feel that the light goes on in the note. So that's the first step. Now, once we have established that, we then go to playing with a single finger. So for instance, a scale, I will make them play it with a single finger. So now we are going to start to move between the notes using very, very painfully slow slides. And by doing that, we are forcing ourselves essentially to listen to the exact size of each interval, yeah? So because you have to really figure out, where do I need to stop? It's almost like, you're there with a very fine measuring tape saying, okay, how big is that interval? And again, it's when I do that work in my own practice, it's mentally enormously tiring, because you're really, as I always say to my students, I want you to really strain to listen. It should really feel, like quite hard work. Like really think, how precise can I get it? And of course, the biggest challenge that I find in my teaching practice is to get students to do things slowly, because the one thing that is so important is the slow speed, because that's really where you make the gains, because it's relatively easy to do that, but it's much harder to do even for me, doing it at that speed is a lot more difficult than simply doing a shift. So the next step, the next strategy that I use is I make the student hit in a passage the individual notes out of thin air. So the two exercises before should already have considerably improved the pitch discrimination, yeah? So to hear what is in tune, what isn't in tune. So now we bring in that feeling of proprioception, of muscle memory, and we are now retraining it correctly. But now we are practicing hitting those notes out of thin air. So we are going to hit them with no preparation, just hand totally relaxed down by the side of the cello or violin or viola or bass or whatever it is we're using. So down and so, and again. And the same with the next note. Now, what does that activate? That activates, again, this what Derek mentioned earlier with the mouthpiece, the idea that you have to hear the note before you play it. I always say to students that, intonation is very much a process of triangulation. It's very much like using a sat-nav. Yeah? A Google Maps is great, but if you don't know your destination, it really can't help you an awful lot. Yeah? The first thing you have to do is you have to put a destination in. And that is the same here. We have to teach a student to, first of all, everything we play, it needs to have been processed in here first. And that, by coming from nothing, the only way you can do that is hear the note and then find your way to it. So I find that at that stage, once students, they're quite often surprised, actually, that exercise really initially scares people. And they're often very surprised that they can actually suddenly, after having done all the potato and the single finger, everything, that they can do that. And psychologically, that exercise is very important, because once we know, we have that inner confidence that I can hit a note, and especially in the higher register of the instrument, absolutely out of thin air, suddenly there's a whole different level of confidence. I suddenly know that, you know what, if I can hit that note from out of nowhere, then finding it in context is not actually that terrifying anymore. And then, at the final step, we reintroduce the original fingering. I'll have the student play the original passage, obviously, on the speed, to be able to really, really listen. And by that stage, usually, you will hear significant improvements in intonation. And not only have we fixed that particular passage, but suddenly the student is going home with a toolbox of how to work on intonation in whatever context that they are practicing. And that is very, very important to me in my teaching. Really, everything I try to do from the very first lesson onwards, and I a little bit like what Nia's mentioned about the pianist whose book she referenced. I teach a very wide spectrum, really, from 7-year-old beginners all the way to postgrads and people preparing for job auditions. The idea is throughout this process to build an ever bigger toolkit. because that's really, as players, that's what enables progress, and that also what enables really lifelong maintenance of our skills, that you know if something isn't working, and the situation that something isn't quite working is one that in the practice room at whatever age and stage and in your career you're at is something you'll encounter in your practice room all the time. I, as a player and as a teacher, I need to make sure that me and my students, we have got the toolkit. So what I just want to finish a little bit more with explaining what actually happens in the brain during this sort of staged process that I have just shown. What happens during this process is that what's called the neural weighting changes. What do we pay attention to? What suddenly becomes more important in the brain? Yeah, the sound waves, the auditory signals that were previously just more or less background noise, they suddenly become the primary input, the primary information. So it's almost like that is suddenly the bit that is under the microscope. And as I said before, initially all the attention goes to motor survival. But if we are applying these strategies that I've just shown frequently and consistently, pitch discrimination will improve very, very, not only rapidly, but also permanently, because it's almost like we're making this imprint on the brain that is what it should sound like. And of course, and once, what is really interesting to see is that once you've started doing that work with students, this tolerance threshold that I was speaking about earlier for, let's call it approximation, goes right down, and suddenly it's like, ew, you know, things that even maybe 10 minutes earlier they would have completely, wouldn't even have registered on the radar. Suddenly it's like, whoa, where's that coming from? What I find the funniest is when I see that with my students and I do that work, suddenly they become hyper aware of any kind of inaccuracy, not just in themselves, but especially in everyone else. I get them coming, you know, home from a school and they're like, everyone is playing so out of tune. It's like, well, yeah, you actually did this well a week ago. So, but when that happens, then you know the process is working. And of course, whilst slips will certainly initially, they will continue to occur. I mean, even, you know, for us, if I have to start, you know, sight reading a completely new piece, it's not all going to be exactly, you know, bang on the first reading. But, and here is the crux, the student now starts to self-correct. And that is in any kind of teaching situation, the moment I find the student, I don't have to say anything, the student stops and says, hang on a second, that wasn't right, let me do that again. That's a situation when I go home happy, because I know I have now put them in charge. Because my overall goal as a teacher is I want to make myself redundant. The sooner the better. So the less input I have to give, the more I can see them self-correct. It means the gains are going to compound, because that means their practice will start to be efficient. And again, once we have increased the confidence in the intonation and everything, we suddenly have freed up a whole load of mental capacity to then really drill down into the mechanical details. You know, that's really, then we have got way more capacity to really work on, you know, nuances of bowing and vibrato and phrasing, all of these things. But we have fixed one thing that is, the thing with intonation is, I think out of all the possible sort of technical issues that we can have, it's in a totally different category to everything else, because it's much more, for some reason, much more personal. It's a thing that certainly as a string player, that you fear the most? Almost everything we do in our practice room is motivated by the fear that when we go on stage, we don't want to be missing a note. Because the reality is, I'm working with nearly, 2 foot of string lengths here, and the right spot is, not even 1 millimeter wide. So that is something, it's a huge, intonation for us. It also has a huge psychological aspect to it for us. So that's why it's something I try to work on very, very early with students. I try to give them those tools. Obviously, as young kids, again, in a very, sort of relaxed, very playful world, but I want to give them the tools as early as possible. Because once they can hear themselves playing cleanly, the motivation really starts to go through the roof. So that was my contribution.
Thank you very much, Julia. It was fascinating. I should definitely try that potato trick. Are there any direct questions to Julia? We will have a little break in a minute, but if things occur to you, please do come back at the end of the whole session to ask questions. Anybody want to follow up at the moment?
And I was going to say, if anyone has any questions that they think of sort of midway through, again, do put them in the chat, because we can revisit them all rather than having to worry about remembering them at the end. So that's fine as well.
Well, before we go to a break and hear the remaining 2 presentations, I'd just like to share my perception of what our first 2 presenters have brought to mind, which is about good communication. Being able to communicate to those people we're working with and get across ways they can experience the idea which Nias produced of making sounds on instruments and the intonation trick with Julia. I mean, that's, for me, is good communication. The other issue, I think, which I find from my own experience, is it's quite hard to explain to young learners that there's an element of patience they're going to actually have to portray in developing the skills that they want. And I was certainly put in my place relatively recently when a former student of mine said, "Would you listen to one of my students, please? She's 9 years old, and I think maybe she might be a bit special. I'd love to have your viewpoint." So I arranged to meet this little 9-year-old who was quite precocious. And she played to me very nicely. And I said to her, "What do you find most difficult about playing?" And she said, "Oh, it's so difficult playing in tune." I didn't think of the potato trick, but I did come up with some other ideas for her. And she was okay, but she said, "It seems like an awful lot of work having to do what you've recommended." I said, "Well, there's only really one alternative to actually working at improving." I said, "I could offer to go off on a quest to find Aladdin's lamp. And when I actually discover it and release the genie, I'm going to say, well, I'd like you," I won't give her name, "I'd like you to be able to allow my friend to play in tune for the rest of her life without any effort." And I said that my second wish is I'd like to be able to play in tune myself for the rest of my life without any effort. I then paused, and the little girl said, "Well, what about the third wish?" So I said, "Well, I haven't really thought about that one." She said, "Well, it doesn't matter. It's all just a story anyhow. So I suppose I'll just have to practice the way you've told me to." But what was helpful, I think, was using a little bit of a fantasy to actually still get her to focus on, "Oh, okay, I suppose if I've got to do what you're asking me to, I guess I've got to do it." So communication, as teachers, we're performers, aren't we? We are performers in our performing life when we perform on our instruments, but we're also performing with our students to excite them to solving problems, to wanting to learn. And it's interesting that some of my friends and family, they wonder why I spend, I think, about 16 hours a week now, sometimes 20, teaching, when I'm well past retirement age. And I say to them, because I can start the day feeling my age or feeling tired and lethargic, but as soon as I start teaching, I feel 25 again and just feel so excited by actually working. I think it's a privilege for us to be engaged with these young people and to really support and stimulate their learning. And I absolutely love it, and I will continue to love it for as long as I'm able to do it. But if we hopefully you're suitably refreshed. So without spending any more time talking at you, I'd like to get a perspective from a vocal teaching perspective now and ask Peter to join us and to make his presentation. Thank you, Peter.
Hello, yes, thanks, Derek. My name is Peter Knapp, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share my ideas with you in the Royal Society about how musicians are being trained today, especially in the conservatoires. If I could just introduce myself, my own musical career began as a cathedral choir boy and a student of the violin. I was then a chorus scholar at Cambridge and began working professionally in choirs and operatic choruses before being given the opportunity to study in Italy with one of the great Italian baritones, Tito Gobbi. And then I sang my first major role in the Glyndebourne tour, and after that was fortunate enough to sing many of the mainstream baritone roles that I've studied with the maestro. Mid-career, I set up British Youth Opera and then my own touring company, which led me into training performers. And over the last 20 years or so, I've been teaching mostly at Trinity, Laban, as well as in drama colleges and business centres. More recently, I trained as a yoga teacher and have since incorporated its principles into my coaching pedagogy, researching also other somatic methods like Alexander technique that have proved successful in performance training. So the purpose of this little presentation is to affirm my belief that a clear understanding of how the body physically functions and a dedicated physical training should become integral to any performance training. The way a student holds themselves and carries out a physical action needs to be looked at very closely at an early stage for the subsequent singing or instrumental teaching to be fully effective. I've divided my presentation then into the following 4 sections. Firstly, we'll take a look at basic anatomy and muscle physiology to establish what constitutes good posture and how the actions of performing are carried out. Only when the body is perfectly balanced will the playing or singing be efficiently supported and true resonance of the body able to be fully realized and sustained. Next, we'll consider the breathing system and how it can be made to operate more efficiently and expansively. Then, third section, I'll look briefly at the elements of lifestyle, such as diet, since this can impact on physical performance. And finally, we'll think about walking onto a stage and working on stage and maintaining a presence there for long periods of time. Please put any questions you might have onto the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them at some point in the future. Starting then with the musician's need, I believe, for a basic understanding of anatomy and physiology. I recall Tito Gobbi's first comment to me when I began working with him in Italy, that your legs, when performing, need to have the strength of sprung steel. Growing up in northern Italy, in fact, as he had done, he'd been an international skier before he became an actor-singer, very topical. And as I began to ski myself, coming from a fairly vigorous sporting background, I recognized the similarity between skiing and singing. What I now call the drop when teaching singers how to approach a high note corresponds to the feeling of dropping your weight just before you do a parallel turn in skiing. The thigh muscles, or quadriceps, have to be strong enough to resist the weight drop. And the consequence is that tension is released from the upper half of the body, something as essential in skiing as it is in playing a musical instrument or singing. I start a class, therefore, with an exercise I call the schuss, which is like skiing straight down the fall line of a mountain, where I encourage the natural folding of the body into a sort of monkey-like bend, the natural position of our bodies would adopt. From the forward bend, I next ask the class to raise their torso slowly back to an upright posture, carefully considering which muscles they use in order to achieve this. The key muscles are the quadriceps, the strongest muscles in the body, which lever the body upwards as far as a sort of ape-like position. And then the firm engagement of the back muscles bring the body into a perfect upright posture, whereby the spine retains its correct curvature, the skull sits happily balanced on the top of the spine, not having to be held there by the leg muscles, with the limbs and working parts in the upper part of the body free of unwanted tension. This is support, created by the equal and opposite reaction of specific muscles to the downward force of gravity, and needs to be maintained throughout every phrase of every piece of music performed. What happens when a singer or instrumentalist exerts a force to create a sound by blowing or bowing is that this causes the body to collapse inward, reinforced by gravity. And so, which means the support muscles have to exert even more force to balance this. It is essential, therefore, to have identified the support muscles to strengthen them and keep them well toned. Carefully guided yoga, I find, is the ideal way to do this. But it needs to be practiced at least every other day in order to be effective in developing the performer. Also, weight training, resistance training, again carefully guided to avoid unwanted tension, will build up power in the key support muscles, the legs and the back. Moving on then to consider next the breathing system. The efficiency of this is very much, of course, depends on maintaining good posture. As I mentioned in our forward bend or monkey hang, you can feel the expansion of the ribs right around the back as we breathe, and sense a greater expansion because it is in this position that the body functions best. I go on to explain how the diaphragm, a double-domed sheet of collagen with muscles attached to it, moves up and down like a valve in a bicycle pump. Its downward movement on the in-breath creates a vacuum in the torso, and so air is drawn into the lungs. On the out-breath, the muscles relax and the diaphragm floats gently back up as the air is exhaled. The efficiency of the breathing system is greatly enhanced by the engagement of the external intercostal muscles. If you push your thumbs into your lower ribs and register delighted surprise on a sudden in-breath, you can identify these muscles as the ribs expand outwards. The development of these muscles is essential, therefore, not only to optimize the volume of air you take into your lungs, so you can comfortably play or sing long phrases of music, but for two other key reasons. The engagement of these muscles opens up the natural resonance of the body, that is, the hollow areas of the body, the torso, the mouth and throat, and the sinuses around the eyes and nose. They also, on the initiation of the sound, set up the support system, working as synergists with the legs and the back. These muscles in a young adult are often very limited in their movement. And so I prescribe, as my very first voice teacher did, resistance training by wrapping a scarf around these muscles, tightly around the rib cage, and working the muscles against that tension. Yoga is also good for awakening these muscles and restoring them to their full functional length in poses requiring the intense upward stretching of the arms, for example. I also prescribe strengthening exercise for the abdominal muscles, the muscles that push the diaphragm upwards and create subglottal pressure necessary to sing or play a wind or brass instrument. As the muscles of the diaphragm kick in, reinforced by gravity, the opposing support muscles have to be reinforced in order to balance correctly the action of making a sound. What I find is that these support muscles are generally weak and cannot match the power of the abs and gravity. They need consistent toning separate from singing or playing, I believe. Moving on then to the third area I was going to consider, applying a clear physical understanding of the body to the creation of sound, and articulating language and musical phrasing. Without a firm support system being established before the breath is taken in to play or sing, it's going to be difficult to place or initiate the sound correctly. It will also be more difficult to respond to the musical demands of the piece as you go along, for instance, when a high climactic note is required, or when a particular section of challenging articulation needs to be addressed. With the demand of singing a high note, for example, as I mentioned earlier, I always suggest trying to create the sensation of dropping the weight, as done in skiing before a turn, to release the tension from the upper body, resonating part of the body, and therefore creating a necessary space before actually singing the note. But this requires very strong legs. With regard to the articulation of the language, I encourage students to regard this as being aware of meeting the resistance created by each individual sound. Flexibility as well as strength is required to do this, again, something that any somatic practice is going to improve. Coming to the third area to discussion, diet and lifestyle, I'd like to consider psychological considerations such as performance anxiety and the striving for perfection. Also, I believe that any serious performance training should include a study of the positive or negative effects of certain foods. It's worth looking also at complementary health regimes which, like yoga, usually originated in the East, which place emphasis on the prevention of health problems and recognizing the body's ability to heal itself under the right conditions. Much study is being carried out around the psychological aspects of being a performer in such a high-pressure industry. But certainly in my experience of resistance training, and yoga in particular, I've found them to be very effective in calming the mind, focusing the attention, and clearing away unwanted distraction. Finally, when we take into account standing on stage and performing, we need to identify how much strength standing or even sitting actually requires if we are to maintain a real presence and effectively communicate what we are intending to say or express. The appearance of strength and coordination also applies to the process of auditioning, I find. When I was in the position of auditioning a lot of singers, my level of interest was initially sparked by how the candidate entered the room and walked across to take up their performing position by the piano. To conclude then, such is the importance of physical strength and fitness in relation to every element in the training of a musician. I firmly believe that institutions should make regular guided physical awareness and training an integral part of any course of study. I also believe teachers should undergo some sort of training in muscle use and support mechanism so that at least they can confidently refer a student to some appropriate somatic practice that will help them. Thank you very much for your attention, and of course, if you have any questions, put them on the chat and I'll attend to them as soon as I can. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. Are there any direct questions of Peter's presentation? Or, as I say, I will leave an opportunity at the end of the sessions to ask questions of any of the presenters. I believe Peter has to go off and do some actual work, so he may actually have to respond via the chat. Just before bringing Chiara in, I would just like to follow up on what Peter's just said. You know, if you are a classroom teacher, you have to get a a postgraduate certificate of education or some form of teaching qualification, which involves you in studying psychology and communication techniques. As instrumental vocal teachers, we get qualifications in being able to perform. We may well have done some elements of pedagogy in our training. Trinity Laban offers a master's in music education, but we don't really have the same focus on being able to actually teach that you actually are as compulsory as a classroom teacher. And that's why I think forums like this are so important. I've already learned from the first presenters aspects of what they are using their teaching, which I'm going to incorporate in mine. And I think what excites me about this type of event is getting people to share these strategies, because we do not have a natural way of doing this other than just by meeting colleagues or by going on a course or through whatever is sent out by the various representative bodies. But it's people at the coalface sharing with enthusiasm and excitement those things which have actually motivated them to go on doing what is, after all, quite an intensive and tiring activities to actually communicate on a one-to-one basis. So I'd like to bring, if we're all happy to do that, Chiara. And Chiara also is a pianist, but she's going to actually approach her presentation from a completely different angle to what we've heard so far. And you will see what I mean when I introduce her. So Chiara, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Derek. Yes. When Derek first asked me to take part in this session on transformational teaching, I immediately thought about the student that I'm going to talk about. I will refer to him as M. And I initially tried to think about other students as well. Of course, students that are learning very advanced repertoire, taking part in competitions, playing as soloist with orchestras. But this student just kept coming back to me. And in the end, I decided that this is what I'm going to talk about. And it's because the change from the beginning of when I started teaching him to how he is now is just, well, it's just so amazing and noticeable that I couldn't help but choosing it as a topic. When I first started teaching M, he was 8 years old, and he struggled with using fingers independently. He's on the autism spectrum and not fully verbal. And his parents thought that learning piano could help with gaining fine motor skills that are useful in everyday life. They also knew that M really enjoys listening to music, and they already had a digital piano at home where they had put color stickers on the keys to start playing some simple tunes with him. So they looked for a piano teacher, and unfortunately, this piano teacher had to stop lessons after a while and, well, put them in contact with me. They chose to have 20-minute lessons online. And normally I wouldn't, of course, recommend 20 minutes lessons online as the first choice, but for him it was perfect. He could maintain a good level of focus for that amount of time, and it could be done in his own home in a familiar environment. So we started with a first trial lesson, and they showed me what they had been learning with the previous teacher, of course, and from there I started to build a routine of exercises and songs to go through in every lesson. And this is still working today after 5 years. We've just expanded the routine and changed it, but at the core, it stayed the same. The start of the lesson is dedicated to warming up and continuing to develop finger awareness, just awareness of each individual finger. And we start with the duck exercise, which I got from Penelope Roscoe. It's just doing this, and we count how many times we do it. It's always the same amount of times, so it helps keeping the routine steady. And then we count how many times we do each individual finger. And then we join fingertips together like this and count, well, actually name each finger number. So like this, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3. At first, this wasn't easy, and M's parents had to help him with the physical movement, but it gradually became a very familiar movement for him, and he can now do it very well. The next thing after the finger tapping is just rubbing the palms together to feel the palms and then feel the top of each hand. And I can see, even though of course we are having the lesson online, I can see that there is a positive reaction to the sensation. Then we move on to the piano, still as part of the warm-up, and play all the 2 black keys. Of course, this is an exercise that we all do with beginners, but with him I've kept it, and I was able to observe that the improvement in playing all the 2 black keys was how he approached the key and how the fingers developed a nice arch and strength, and he was able to find every set of black keys jumping an octave higher or lower very easily. But at first this had to be done with a guided movement of the arm by the parents. After that, we move on to a more more sort of exercise. We call it finger gymnastics at the piano, playing on the notes C, D, E, F, and G, which are marked with colors on his piano. And we initially just started with using the thumb and the second finger, alternating them. And then gradually moved on to adding more combinations. So we expanded with 1 new combination every week, and or less often if it wasn't working yet. And so the full routine now gets from doing 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 to 1, 5, 1, 5, and then gradually moved on to 2, 3 as well, alternating 2 and 3, 2 and 4, and 1, 3, and 5. So being able to play a chord, both broken and as a block. And also this had to be initially physically guided by one of the parents, but it worked. It gradually became something that M can do completely by himself. At the same time, we sing the names of the colors. We don't use the names of the notes, but it's been quite successful with this color system. The next part of the lesson is more centered on playing short pieces or short tunes. Again, they have to be within the range of C to G, but in this as well, the improvement has been so inspiring to watch. We started with very simple tunes with maximum 5, 6 notes in them, and the colors were written on a piece of paper with just colored dots, and M would be able to follow them with the help of a parent pointing to the color on the page and moving his arm. And then very gradually we got to the point that he didn't need his arm to be guided anymore, and at some point also didn't need a parent to show him the next dot to keep his focus on the page. And the tunes became longer, and he can now read independently a whole page of notes written with this system. And with either hand, which has also been quite a successful work because it developed his ability in just day-to-day life of using both hands. And also, and that's been really incredible to watch, with both hands at the same time in parallel octaves, quite long tunes. Then one thing that we started developing more recently is to form the base of an improvisation that he can do with one of his parents. They used to have one of the parents playing chords of C major and F major, alternating them, and improvising on white keys on top. But now he's also able to play the chords, and so he will be able to accompany his parents improvising. One last thing that I would like to say about these lessons is that I've had to just from online lessons pick up on cues of needing a little break or a relaxing moment, and simple things like playing glissando on white keys or on black keys were always very welcome, or going back to a tune that he knew by heart have been well, they've been good tools to use in those moments. I would just like to say that this the work with the student has been incredibly rewarding, and also seeing the dedicated work of his parents, without whom it would have been completely impossible, has been very humbling. And so in the end, I didn't speak about students playing the revolutionary etude, but playing something like Baby Shark. But I think in a way it's the most transformational experience I've witnessed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I think you've actually touched on a really important area of music teaching, in that there is a much greater awareness these days of students with learning difficulties. I have two granddaughters, one who is quite severely autistic and the other one has ADHD, and it's becoming more known, it's becoming more common for young people to be presenting with these difficulties. And again, it's not part of our training, learning how to actually adapt teaching to suit people with a different way of perceiving and acquiring information. So I'm really pleased that we've touched on this area. I think what is a little disappointing in my own career is that when I started teaching over 50 years ago, there wasn't a lot of information available to assist my teaching. It was basically learned on the job. These days, there is information out there if you go and seek it, but we do not have an established scientific support system. If you're a sports person, sports science really supports improving people's performance. And now this country does a rather better at things like the Olympics than it used to in the past. But we don't have a music science as really attached to music development in the same way that sports science is attached to sports, and dance science as well, because perhaps there's more an obvious use of potential injury. But there is statistical information out there which shows that 40% of all performing musicians will experience performance-related injury in their careers. And that's probably the 40% who've admitted to it. It's probably much higher than that. So preventing injury has got to really be, the foundation for that has got to be right at the very beginning, teaching people ways of learning their instrument which actually are more physically natural than holding a violin under your chin or blowing down a reed. We need to make learning as accessible as possible to everybody that we teach. And also, I think, as musicians and teachers, we need to remind ourselves of actually how lucky we are to be doing this, to actually have the privilege of being engaged in people's understanding and love for music. So my own teaching range is from an 11-year-old who's the granddaughter of close friends of mine who I started aged 8. And that's been quite challenging because I haven't taught children for many years, up to somebody over 80 who's come back to learning their instrument at a later stage in their life. And my enthusiasm is no different. Of course, I'm lucky enough to actually work with Conservatoire students, but as Peter implied, quite a lot of those students have already physical issues, which will only get worse as they progress. I'd like to think that all music training eventually would have a more scientific bias towards it, and that even if we can't expect individual teachers to be all things to all people, that there were ways of accessing support and information. And in that, I really appreciate and celebrate the work of the Royal Society of Musicians in that they are holding webinars like this, and certainly the one I attended last year and contributed to on the healthy musician. It's so important. And I do hope we might hold some more of these webinars in the future, because I really do want to hear from people out there doing the job. I'd rather not be actually just giving my own experience. I really want to hear from everybody, and let's share our experiences and support each other through those experiences. Now, we've come to the situation now where you are very welcome to ask questions of any of the presenters or of me, or if you prefer to actually send items in via the chat, either now or later on, and which we will attempt to answer. But I'm so excited that so many of you have decided to join this. There's nothing worse than being talked at, and which can appear to be patronizing, but the fact that there's so many of you who've been open enough to attend this webinar gives me great optimism for the future of our profession. So is there anything we can answer you now, or if not, we can actually think about lunch?
Derek, I think a few people have sort of put questions in the chat, which they have been answered actually as well. So I think from the chat side, it's all covered. But if anyone does have any questions that they do want to raise now, or comments for Derek and all the presenters, I mean, from my side, it's been incredibly interesting. I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to talk to us all, because it's been really insightful, I think. So, but over to everyone else to see if anyone's got any comments. George Caird, I can see you might have something to say.
Yeah, Derek, I want to chime in and just thank you enormously for doing this, because I know how deep your experience is after so many years, and the fact that you're bringing this and bringing some super people in to talk in this way is just brilliant, actually. So thank you very much for doing it. It's much appreciated.
Well, thank you, George. And perhaps if we do one of these again, you might contribute from your vast experience as a performer and teacher of the oboe.
Well, always available, but I'm bowing to you on this occasion, Derek.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, George. It's lovely to speak to you. Good. Any further comments from anybody? Well, if not, may I wish you all success in your teaching, and keep on inspiring other people. It's the greatest thing we could do in life. But thank you so much for your attendance and your attention. It's much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, everybody.